So good afternoon, everyone. My name is Kevin Gonzalez. I am a formerly incarcerated student. I go to Cal State LA. I am also the program coordinator for Project Rebound at Cal State LA. And welcome to the solitary confinement panel here at Beyond the Bars, Los Angeles, 2017. Um, so we have with us to discuss issues of solitary confinement here in California. Uh, Danny Murillo, Michael Saavedra, we have Tava Scheffler, and Sarah Short. I will let each individual panelist introduce themselves. However, I'd like to give a special thanks to Michael. Michael helped coordinate this panel in particular, um, as everybody has knowledge of solitary confinement and being in the shoe. It was at Michael's extensive, you know, dedication that sort of brought the right people together that could give, the most beneficial information here and panel and sort of look at the progress that's been made here in California from different points of view. So Michael was recently released from CDC this February after 19 years in prison. He spent the last 12 of those 19 years in solitary confinement. As a result of this unjust treatment and lack of access to quality legal representation within the correctional system, Michael taught himself law. To date, he has successfully litigated many civil rights and criminal cases on behalf of himself and of others. Michael is currently engaged with several reentry organizations working to support and assist the formerly incarcerated in their transition back into communities. He is currently enrolled in the Pathways to Law program at Riverside City College, with his academic career set on UCLA School of Law, right here. He is dedicated to assisting those wrongfully convicted and seeking a positive reentry back into community. I'd say so myself. I met him, not too long after he got out, and he's doing a good job because, look, we're all here. Yeah, so I'll hand it off to you, Danny.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Danny Murillo. I'm formerly incarcerated as well. Spent, half my sentence in solitary confinement, about 7 years. I did 14, and then what I'm going to be doing today, I'm going to be writing. So a lot of the work that I do is just trying to help people right now get into higher education, and I love that work. But that's what I want to do is I love academia. I want to be a scholar. I want to sit there and unpack stuff, And what I'm going to read with y'all is it's a 5-page paper about solitary confinement, and I just came up with the title of it right now. I had it for about 3 years already. Solitary confinement, an act of genocide.
Hello, everyone. Thank you all for coming. It really means a lot to me and to bring a lot of awareness to what has been going on in this state with solitary confinement. I'm not a really good speaker. I'm kind of nervous, so if you guys can bear with me, but I would like to just address a couple issues through my story. I was put in solitary confinement in 2004, and based on prison gang allegations, which for years, in fact decades, CDC would do mostly Hispanics, some blacks, and some whites, based on simple things such as drawings, signing a birthday card. They try to connect you and say you're an associate of the prison gang, and therefore they can keep you in solitary confinement indefinitely, meaning forever. So in 2011, we formed a coalition of prisoners, mostly in Pelican Bay, and to do a hunger strike to try to bring awareness to the public, like, hey, look what's going on. This is not cool at all. This is torture, and we're tired of being in here due to the fact that CDC would not release us from solitary confinement unless we either snitched, paroled, or died. which is some very harsh ways to get out, and especially the whole debriefing. They call it debriefing, right? So they tell you, okay, we're going to keep you in solitary confinement forever, but if you want access to programs, you want to hug your loved ones, you have to debrief. In other words, snitch. And I guess some people, that's their way out, but for me and most of the people, it's putting yourself at danger, and not only yourself, but your families. And I think that's not the way to go out, because the way CDC forces it upon you and tries to press you into it, they basically want you to tell on yourself and tell on everybody you know. And that's not cool. For me, if I got myself into this situation, or even if I was put in here wrongfully, I'm not going to bring other people down just because I want out. So we continued with the hunger strikes, and we made a little headway. CDC acquiesced with, giving us little extra property stuff, but it wasn't enough. We wanted better due process. We wanted meaningful hearings and reviews. So we went on another one, and this time it was pretty long, like close to 60 days. But it brought a lot of awareness, and it brought a lot of people out there to see what was going on and to support us. One of them being Sarah Short, who's an amazing person, and she wrote a play about us. And of course, Tava Scheffler here, California Prison Focus, a lot of lawyers and free people, Families Against Solitary Confinement, and many others, All of Us or None. It was amazing for us going through that, because when you're stuck in a cell and you're starving yourself to death, literally, to hear about these people, free people who actually care and are willing to stand up and push for us. I'm sorry. It's I get a little emotional talking about it, because it was really, yeah, it was a moment in my life that really changed my life. And so we were very thankful to have all these organizations and people out here, standing up for us. And it led to Senate committee hearings and class action lawsuits, which really hit CDC hard. And they ended up settling after quite a while. I had already spent 12 years in solitary, and they released us all. So the majority of us, but they still do their little underground tactics and refuse to release people on parole who now have, action to get out on parole, using the same tactic of you need to debrief or you're not going to go home. So it's kind of a revolving door. And again, I'll just like to thank all the people out here and these two wonderful people, and Danny, especially Danny, because when I got out, before I got out, I started, teaching myself to read, to do the law and, learn the law and litigate. And I was successful in quite a few cases. And when I got out, I met this gentleman here, and I met her right there. Yeah. So it was awesome. And then I met this guy right here, and he really inspired me that, what, just because you have a record, or, you're out on parole or whatever, you can still be a scholar, go to Berkeley or go to UCLA. So, yeah, that's my inspiration. We ain't the worst of the worst, huh? No, we aren't. So I'd like to kick it off to this lady who really did amazing work with watching over CDC during the hunger strikes and visiting us and making sure we were treated humanely and continuing to do litigation on the subject.
Yeah, hi everyone. My name is Tava Scheffler, and I'm an attorney out of San Francisco. And I met Michael in my capacity as a volunteer, as a volunteer legal director for California Prison Focus, which is an organization committed to ending solitary confinement. And the organization was started in 1991 with the building of Pelican Bay State Prison, which is prison up at the very top of our state. And the facility is an entirely solitary confinement prison. So it was built, to be a modern, technological, which basically means in the avoidance of all human contact. And so the model SHU, which we have brought here from the Hunger Strike Solidarity Coalition, also based in the Bay Area and across the state, has built a model SHU to size of some of the Pelican Bay SHU cells. But keep in mind that there are solitary confinement units across every prison. Pelican Bay was just one that was built to be all solitary confinement all the time. And so now I work with an organization called the Prisoner Advocacy Network, and we are training individuals and community members to do individual advocacy for folks on the inside who identify as activists and jailhouse lawyers and who have extreme medical needs. And I'd like to talk a little bit, as we go through today about some of the changes that the Ashker class action lawsuit that Michael talked about, the way it did change solitary confinement in California. And, for several years now, I feel like, or at least since the settlement was announced in 2015, I have just been thrilled to have the opportunity to talk about the changes that have happened in solitary confinement and the use and what's really changed in the sense of this notion that your political affiliations and who you know can land you in such extraordinarily inhumane conditions for the rest of your life. And for me, I see political prisoners everywhere. I think everybody in our system of mass incarceration is a political prisoner, and we can talk about that. But I also think that when you dig into that definition, something about being where you are and imprisoned and punished purely because of your beliefs and not because of your actions is an important factor to keep in mind when we talk about political prisoners. And that relationship that Michael's speaking about, this conversation between guard and encaged individual of you can get out of here anytime you want as long as you snitch. Right? Are you ready to talk today, Saavedra? What is that conversation? For years, we're talking about a moment where, that is, to me, the definition of psychological torture. And not to mention the banging on the cells every half hour to make sure that you're alive, right? Every half hour, 24/7, which is still going on today. So we're talking about psychological torture. And as excited as I am about hitting a 2-year anniversary of the Ashker settlement and the fundamental changes to long-term indefinite isolation, I still carry a heavy message, which is solitary confinement is alive and well here in California prisons. And the limit that Ashker has achieved, which is no more than 5 years per crime or per offense, does not, to me, create a world without solitary confinement. And so California Prison Focus is still definitely around, and we're still sending folks inside to visit. And I'd like to talk a little bit more about some of those changes and what we have accomplished and what we have yet to accomplish. So.
Hey, everybody. It's an honor to be here with all these amazing people. You are amazing, Michael. I'm Sarah Shord. I'm a journalist and a playwright. You're going to be able to see a few scenes from my play about solitary confinement. It's called The Box today. What brought me to this work was that in 2009, I was living as a... Did this turn off? Oh, there we go. In 2009, I was living as a journalist in Damascus, Syria, and studying Arabic, and I was captured along with my boyfriend and friend along the Iraq-Iran border. And I was held as a political hostage by the Iranian government in solitary confinement for over a year. So I came back to this country, and it wasn't news to me that mass incarceration was an abomination, a horrible injustice. I was raised by a single mom activist here in LA, actually, Chicago, LA. I've been in the Bay Area ever since. But I didn't know that solitary confinement was so widespread. And I also didn't know that it wasn't a clearly agreed upon thing, that it was torture. Because anyone who's experienced it doesn't question that. So I came back, and part of my getting back on my feet and figuring out what to do with my freedom was reaching out to people that had experienced what I experienced to try to understand what had happened to me and, what had happened to my own mind. So I started writing prisoners across the country and visiting them. I visited over a dozen facilities and participated in in-depth letter correspondences with over a dozen people for 6 months. And I wove those into a book that I edited of stories of people called Hell is a Very Small Place, and into the play that you'll get a taste of today. So yeah, it's an honor to be here.
Thank you. To sort of open up, I'd like to ask Danny to read his paper that he has for us. I think it shows sort of it gives a story, an interesting story coming from, coming from the streets and ending up, in the shoe. And so Danny, go ahead and start with that. Thank you.
All right, then. So, like I said, I just came up with the title earlier today, actually right now, Solitary, an Act of Genocide. I'm going to focus on solitary confinement and how it relates to our larger conversation of mass incarceration and the prison industrial complex. Using my personal experience, I'm going to point out how solitary confinement tears families and communities apart, and how the state rationalizes the use of solitary confinement to criminalize the political and cultural identity of Black and brown people. In 1996, at the age of 16, I was on my second trip to juvenile hall. However, this time I was looking at more than the 7 months I previously spent at a Los Angeles County probation camp. I was being charged with one count of kidnapping. He was actually an adult, 1 count of carjacking, and 2 counts of armed robbery with a firearm. The maximum sentence was 75 years to life. I signed a plea bargain for 15 years with 2 felonies, which I then served 13 and 10 months. And of those 13 years and 10 months, I spent a little bit more than 7 months in solitary confinement. Can y'all hear me? We're good? Yeah? All right, cool. Because that's a little noise. I don't. Is that in my head? Nah. In the security housing unit at Pelican Bay State Prison, you are physically isolated from other inmates, prison guards, and the general prison population and the outside world. The SHU is a freestanding prison within a prison. There are no windows to view the outside world. Located in Crescent City, California, the prison is referred to as the Bay. It is the northernmost prison in the state, and because of the distance from the urban centers and from those locations where predominantly Black and brown people are being sent to, from those communities, it was considered a prime location for the construction of this prison site by correctional administrators. The distance between the SHU and California urban centers, where the majority of the people in the SHU are from, makes it difficult for families and friends to visit and maintain those close and personal relationships. The location of the SHU creates another form of isolation by distance from family and friends. The practice of isolation in relation to geographical location reminds me of my experience in the SHU, where I was warehoused for 5 years and never received a visit. Although at this point of my sentence, I didn't want to visit. The distance between the SHU and my family made it difficult to develop and maintain the meaningful and healthy relationships. The SHU isolated me from the life-giving connections that I needed to survive. People in solitary confinement can go for years, right? Like we're talking about like 35, 45 years. Without talking or seeing a family member. Many family interactions while incarcerated is crucial for rehabilitation and reentry. With no access to phones, the psychological torture of solitary confinement goes beyond the prison walls. It impacts families and friends, and it impacts our communities. The rhetoric of institutional security by the California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation gives rise to a system of exclusion and control that rationalizes the criminalization of cultural and political identities. There is nothing innocent in the systematic erasure and the criminalization of colonized people's cultural and political identities. These two are acts of genocide that are reinforced by the prison industrial complex. According to Marta Vanessa Saldivar, quote, the systematic erasure, both in the present and the past, amounts to an occupation of knowledge by erasing the marginalized histories. Settler colonial projects thrive with greater ease as hegemonic narratives of nation building occupy and suppress the critical and oppositional histories of the colonized and oppressed, end quote. The systematic erasure of history has silenced brutal methods of occupation that made it possible for the colonial settlers and the United States government to colonize and enslave and incarcerate in the name of progress. The carceral practices of exclusion and control first employed on the Native and African people by colonial settlers in North America are still present today. The California Department of Corrections has adopted a system of exclusion and control to justify and legitimize the existence of the security housing unit. What is happening within the walls of the SHU is a dehumanization of imprisoned people that have been designated as the worst of the worst by CDCR, and therefore subject to the inhumane treatment of torture by isolation. Solitary confinement is the reproduction of the prisoner or war camps and the plantations that intend to strip those of their humanity and their dignity, while at the same time erasing their culture and political identity, right? So in 2003, while in prison at High Desert State Prison, I was validated as an associate to a prison gang and sent to the SHU at Pelican Bay State Prison. Based on frivolous confidential information, along with cultural drawings and literature that were deemed to be gang-related, I was validated and sent to the SHU. It is CDCR policy to criminalize the cultural and political identity of those in prison. Their argument is based on the criminalization of cultural symbols and political identity as gang activity. After arriving to the SHU, I learned, like George Jackson, after being placed in the Adjustment Center of San Quentin State Prison, that in the SHU, the first struggle that was the one that was being waged was in my own mind. Similar to Gloria Alzandua, who uses quote, the geographical location of her birth as the source of her theorizing, end quote, I situate the security housing unit at Pelican Bay State Prison as my source of consciousness. But not because the SHU was meant to enlighten me, but in spite of what it was supposed to do to me. My spirit resisted resiliently the social pathologies known to develop in prisoners who struggle to adapt to the rigors of solitary confinement. That's why the debriefing program is very effective, right? Because it works to turn people mentally, to be able to hold strong, right? I understood that prison was not only a physical and social construction, but a mental one as well. This new knowledge allowed me to create a program that involved developing my critical thinking skills, as well as the implementation of a holistic program of prosperity. Learning, exercising, playing chess, listening to Democracy Now!, KSSU radio, watching thought-provoking TV like Bill Moyer's journal, Independent Lens, and Point of View, extensive reading, arts and crafts, and corresponding with my mother were all instruments in helping me maintain my sanity and not get lost in the madness of solitary confinement. In addition to the intellectual influence of my fellow brothers, who I was exposed to, even though I never met brother, but I'm sure we know a lot of the same people. There's always like this 6 degree of separation. You're so close, but you're so far, but we all know everybody. We know a bunch of people, right, that were in the SHU with us. Even though I never met him, right? And I'm sorry. In addition to the intellectual influence of my fellow brothers whom I was exposed to during my time in the SHU, during my time in the SHU, played a formative role in my personal and intellectual growth. Our willingness to collaborate in a critical dialogue and view each other as repositories of knowledge and allowed me to develop my critical thinking skills through the inhumane experience of solitary confinement. I developed the skills to analyze, contextualize, and communicate the historical process of prisons in the United States, the criminalization of cultural and political symbols, and the racialization of solitary confinement in California state prisons. While in the SHU, I was able to develop the skills to contextualize my individual and his collective history and make connections between the different histories of racialized people in the United States. The analytical skills I developed while in solitary confinement compelled me to look for reasons and effects that perpetuate the disproportionate rate of Black and brown people being placed in the SHU. My communication skills allow me to articulate my analysis against the use of racialization of solitary confinement as a violation of international human rights and as an inhumane act of physical and spiritual torture. Similar to Saldivar, by thinking critically, I am able to, quote, make connections, excavate marginalized stories, and cross disciplinary boundaries to connect the colonial settler narrative, end quote, narrative that depicts Black and brown people as culturally and biologically inclined to commit acts of violence and therefore subject to the inhumane conditions of solitary confinement under discursive rhetoric of institutional security that influences CDCR solitary confinement policy. According to CDCR, the validation policy is the formal and objective process for identifying and documenting prison gang members and their associates. Validation is a term used to describe the quality control review of gang identifications and to ensure that the IGI are operating under CDCR regulations. In order for IGI to validate a prisoner as an associate or member of a prison gang, they need to provide at least 3 reliable and independent sources indicating association or membership. But get this. IGI has a list indicating 1,500 independent sources that can be used to find a prisoner guilty of prison gang activity. So they're going to find a reason to validate you. You know what I mean? The source can range from confidential information, tattoos, drawings, example, Mexican flag, United Farm Workers symbol, or a Black Panther. Pictures of cultural symbols, for example, Emiliano Zapata or George Jackson. Books, for example, a Nahuatl dictionary or the autobiography of Malcolm X. Letters from families and friends, legal materials, newsletters, magazines, for example, the San Francisco Bayview, and the Chicano Mexicano Prison Project, verbal or written communication with other incarcerated people. The criminalization of cultural symbols and political identity by prison officials is rooted in an ideology of white supremacy and is reinforced by the prison industrial complex. It depicts the culture of black and brown people as criminal, which requires a system of exclusion and control to maintain law and order within an institutional prison setting. The ideologies that created the prisoner with the war camps and the plantations has influenced the policies of CDCR in labeling black and brown people as dangerous prison gang associates or members. Without an understanding of history in the field of critical prison studies, it would be impossible to understand how white supremacy justifies the current system of exclusion and control. America continues to exist as a nation in contradiction to the ideal, quote, that all men are created equal, end quote, with the natural right to, quote, land, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, end quote. History teaches us that the ideology of white supremacy created the system of exclusion and control that is ingrained in the historical narrative of the United States. The validation process is a flawed system with no judicial oversight. At its worst, it is a racist policy that criminalizes the political and cultural identity of those who have been targeted for validation. As a formerly imprisoned person who spent 7 years in solitary confinement, I speak from personal experience, and what I want to share with you is that during my incarceration, I have witnessed numerous individuals being labeled, targeted because they hold in their possession drawings of Aztec, Mayan, or other indigenous cultures, or for having books by Malcolm X, George Jackson, or Nahuatl dictionaries. What this racist policy says to me is that my culture, my heritage, the memory of my ancestors is a violation of CDCR regulations, and therefore under the validation policy, I can be placed under solitary confinement in a cell for 22 and a half hours a day for the duration of my sentence, which could range from a couple of months to the rest of my life. Isolation by distance and the criminalization of cultural and political identities are two of the many ways in the prison industrial complex reinforces acts of genocide, which are rooted in the history of the United States. According to Ofelia Ortiz Cuevas, who was our moderator yesterday, quote, the contemporary era of prison building and policing is part of a racial punishment regime that shares a genealogy with the institution of slavery and the brutal acquisition of Mexican and Indian land. All are ways in which genocide is used against the racial body in a time of crisis, end quote. Article 2 of the Convention of the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide, which was adopted by the General Assembly of the United Nations on December 9th, 1948, states, quote, in the present convention, genocide means any of the following acts committed with intent to destroy, in whole or in part, a national, ethnical, racial, or religious group. As such, A, killing members of the group. Police brutality does that. B, causing serious body or mental harm to members of the group. Solitary confinement has proven to do that. Deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part. Look at our communities infested with drugs, alcohol. D, imposing measures intended to prevent birth within the group. If people are locked up, they can't create families. Forcibly transferring children of the group to another group. We are charging 13-year-olds, 14-year-olds with life in prison, y'all. Thank you.
Thank you, Danny. So from this abuse of power, we have started to see some change. And with this most recent settlement, Asker settlement, I'd like to ask Tava. Tava, there were certain changes that the CDC had to abide by. Can you sort of describe a few of those changes and maybe follow up on, have they been keeping up with it?
Sure. Well, first, thank you, Danny, for your analysis, for breaking it down. Can't wait to share your dissertation and continued works with the students of the future as well. So the Asker settlement was named for Todd Asker, one of the named plaintiffs. And there are 10 named plaintiffs, and there were over 2,500 people who were affected by the settlement. And the main issue that was addressed was just simply time. A resolution that 10 years in solitary confinement is too long, and a rewriting of the rules was agreed upon. And the other claim was also had to do with due process, with this political affiliation issue. So the reason that people had spent decades in solitary confinement was exactly the way Danny describes it, which is about your affiliation and your political beliefs. And so California is now forced to come in line somewhat with constitutional procedural standards of an action-based punishment system within prison, right? So the idea is no longer that when you are validated as a gang member, now you can still be validated as a gang member or an associate, but you can only be put in solitary confinement for inaction, and you can only be put there for 5 years per action. Now, if your action is found to have a nexus or an affiliation with gang activity, then you can be put into what's called a step-down program, which is sort of this behavior modification system that is 2 additional years where you start in solitary confinement. And if you do not comply with that programming, and some may call it brainwashing of different tactics, then you can be put in a restricted custody general population unit, which is also in Pelican Bay SHU, and is a unit that used to be a SHU and is now considered general population. So that brings me to one of the issues that I think, I'll just start off with, that I think needs work, is that when, we reduce the number of people in the SHU, which happened through the Ashker settlement, and then we put people back in a Pelican Bay SHU cell, but we call it general population, we have to really ask ourselves, what kinds of changes are we making? That a few hours outside of cell and access to a proctor to take the test so that you can validate you've taken the test, but still no classrooms, that change is minimal to me, and for many of the people who live that. So, but to go back, so, this action-based system is really important, but as part of that, in the regulations that they've needed to write, it's taken 2 years. There's been a monitoring program of attorneys who are part of the class action have been going in and paying very close attention to what's happening and making sure that people actually are processed. And so one of the major things that happened was in that first year, from 2015 to 2016, they reviewed every person who had been put in as a validated gang member, Michael included, and they were given a review at the Sacramento level, the headquarters level, and over 90% of the people reviewed were removed from solitary confinement. Over 2,500 people were removed from a solitary confinement cell and put into a high security prison. Now, again, I question the difference, in terms of like functionality of confinement, but at the same time, we're dealing with, certainly more access to people, more access to social interaction, access to contact visits, a number of very powerful changes through that. But also in this process, in the definition of gang, they have rewritten the definition of gang in California prisons, and they now call them security threat groups. And whereas there used to be 4 major prison gangs, there are now over 30 security threat groups. And you can have a 2-tiered affiliation, so you can either be a member or you can be an associate. And that list of 140 things, one of the things on that list is possession of contraband, right? And we can break down what possession of contraband means, but there's a 30-page list of different books and articles and magazines that are considered contraband. And if that contraband is affiliated with a security threat group, then all of a sudden your action, which may not be a SHU-able offense, becomes a SHU-able offense by virtue of its relationship to the gang. So prolonged solitary confinement still exists, and what's the most powerful thing about it is that many of these people who have spent decades behind bars are now in general population, and that's been extraordinarily powerful in changing some of the culture and the climate within the yards across the prisons, because these are elders of our communities. These are gentlemen who have spent decades in solitary confinement and who have worked on themselves and have a deep and important analysis to bring to what's happening on general population yards, and that's been a really powerful change. In fact, one of the things maybe I could share this later, but maybe now is just as good of a time as any. The named plaintiffs have written a statement in honor of this 2-year period, and I think maybe before the very end I'd like to read it. But one of the things about it is that because due to constitutional law that is limiting prisoner class actions and prisoner cases in general, class actions like this now can only have a 2-year monitoring period. So it's now presently, right now, on the plaintiff's attorneys to prove to the court that their compliance has not been met and that they need to still be monitored. Now, unfortunately, the magistrate judge who has been monitoring this for the last 2 years is set to retire in November. So it's not looking good for the Ashker monitoring period. And some of the things that Ashker monitoring team have been focused on is length of time and what's called administrative segregation, which is the solitary confinement units that are not in Pelican Bay, but throughout, well, one of them is in Pelican Bay as well, but are throughout all of the other prisons are basically just, or lockdowns, extended lockdowns, where you might be in a cell that's not solitary confinement, you're not in a SHU, you're technically in general population, but you're still spending 23 hours a day in your cell. So these are some of the things that have been forced to be held accountable through the settlement, but the biggest concern right now is what's going to happen when this magnifying glass goes away. And if the monitoring period really does sunset. And it's clear to me, I truly believe that the motivation of the state right now is to get out from under the monitoring, right? Their motivations are not necessarily to change the way in which policing within prison is happening, but to no longer have this observation of, you know, outside citizens, of lawyers, of bringing to light what's happening inside prison. And so I think that's one of the things that really needs to be addressed is the culture of incarceration and the culture of mass imprisonment. As Danny mentioned, I mean, that relationship and the pressure to debrief is the microcosm of racism and of white supremacy in our country at its worst example. And so one other thing I just want to mention is that this challenge of your affiliation with the hunger strike, with potentially past gang membership, is still coming back to haunt many of the men who have been released from solitary confinement now before the parole board. So it was generally understood that you would be released straight from the SHU if you had a determinate sentence, but if you had an indeterminate sentence and you were a lifer and you had to go to the parole board was not about to find that you are eligible for release and that you're no longer a threat to security or whatever, you know, standards are applied if you are in a security housing unit. So now you have the situation where you have the 2,500 people who have been processed and by the prison's own standards have been found to no longer need to be or met the conditions of these kinds of conditions, and yet you have the parole board asking the same questions. Well, you were affiliated with a gang. You never actually have been found to not be affiliated with a gang, and now there's pressure to debrief and to do some of the same actions just in order to get out of prison. And so that is an issue that is really present right now for many of these men who are, 15, 20 years past their initial parole date, and they're hearing from the parole board that they're still not rehabilitated based on the same pieces of confidential information and, petty, really unverifiable information that landed them in the SHU in the first place. And one thing I just want to say about that is that culture, that's what needs to be changed, is this culture of, within the guards and the training and the relationship to, the individuals at this basis. I mean, we're talking about massive systemic racism that comes down to and is played out on individual bodies and in individual interactions. And until we address that culture and we address those levels of dehumanization, I am very concerned that people will continue to sit, maybe not in a SHU any longer, but in ADSEG for a very long time, or the use of lockdowns will be used for a very long time. And just recently in the past state budget, the state approved the hiring of 49 new IGI internal gang investigators, internal security threat group investigators. I don't know what they're going to call them these days, but it's important to understand that the resources are still getting pooled into the communities within prison that hold this power, whose entire job is to go through and read individuals' mail and try and come up with reasons on that list to give people points and put them in more severe conditions. And so, this is still work that needs to be done.
Thank you, Tava. To touch on the subject of how it's systemic, right? Sarah, I'd like to ask you, with your own experiences and maybe with those you correspond with, how is this seen like on a more grander scale, maybe throughout the U.S.? Could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I'd love to. So there was a period after I came back from Iran that of 6 months where all I did was correspond with prisoners in isolation. Like I woke up in the morning, checked the mail, had a dozen letters, and then spent the rest of the day writing people back. Just really intensive, and it was an incredible experience for me of connection. When I got out, I thought it would be all over. I think a lot of people do. And once I get out of this box, I'm never going to have to be alone again. There's a million people that I can hug and, that will just love on me, and I'll just never feel this way again. And it's not the case, right? I mean, the isolation lives inside you. It's walls within walls. And it's so hard to take down those invisible walls. So one of the things that fascinated me the most with the people that I wrote was how they found that connection. For me, there were maybe 6 months at a time where my only connection was knocking through a wall. And we could knock to each other, but if we tried to talk through the food vent, when we got caught, then we would get moved. But the amount of love and beauty and humanity that I could pour into just knocking the symphonies we created together. I knew exactly what they were saying to me. I knew exactly how much they loved me, the texture of those rhythms, and how much my body got into it. I mean, just the incredible ways that human beings will find connection against any odds, any barrier. I found again and again, everywhere that I went in the country, stories of people doing things like, I get Pelican Bay, and everybody making a card for somebody's birthday and signing it, and a cake out of all the stuff they could get from the commissary, and which sounds so delicious. I'm still just like, when am I going to get to try this? I tried to make one, and I'm like, I'm sure it's better than this. I don't know the real recipe, and then passing around the cake and celebrating someone's birthday at the risk of getting 7 more years in the shoe. It's more important to be able to preserve your own human dignity by saying happy birthday to another human being. Connection is just as important to our survival as air and water and food. And that, the hunger strike is an incredible illustration of that. I went without eating for a couple weeks because I wanted to see my boyfriend and friend. These men and women, yeah, right? Mostly men, but yeah, went for 3 months. That's an unfathomable amount of time. But connection and humanity is what sustains us. It's how we preserve our dignity. And it's such a illustration of larger problems endemic to our whole society, right? A hyper-militarized, hyper-capitalized, hyper-technological automated society where we all feel that isolation. We all fight against it every single day. And looking inside to the people that are on the front lines of that, there's just so much humanity. There's so much to learn. And, people like that isolation is designed to break people, and it breaks, people like Kevin and Danny and Michael are the exception, to the rule. It's absolutely the most effective form of torture, I think, that human beings have ever created, this level of isolation, as far as breaking someone's political will, will to resist, and just absolutely leaving them, a shell of themselves. And I just think about the way that our government is doing that on the macro. I think about Standing Rock. I think about communities of color. I think about indigenous communities and how good they are at connection, family, community, preserving. That's where the resistance in this country is, and it's also in the very root of our prison systems. So we're here to celebrate that today. And thank you.
Thank you. From being in, situations like this for so long, a lot of people are left with, it is very traumatizing. For myself, I probably didn't spend anywhere near close to the amount of time as some of the gentlemen up here, or, our brothers and sisters, inside. But I remember, even a couple days being in solitary confinement can have devastating effects on people. So I sort of want to know, for those individuals who have been, let out into GP, how are they doing? I mean, has there been, I mean, for myself, I've heard rumors like, oh yeah, it's going to be crazy, all kinds of mayhem is going to happen. Is this true? Has this happened? I mean, do we know? I'll leave it open for anybody to answer.
Yeah, I think one of the amazing things that all of us, including the organizers of the hunger strike, put together an end of hostilities agreement amongst all races, blacks, brown, and white, which is to be followed by all, and especially on the main lines, which is basically showing each other respect and treating each other as men. And for many years, many decades, black and brown went at it all the time, killing each other, riots, huge riots, and murders. And this was one of the things that, of course, CDC, I hate to say it, but I mean, you've all heard of the Green Wall. You've all heard of the shootings at Corcoran, the gladiator fight setups between us, and they would just be able to shoot us literally with, lethal weapons. And so I think that part of that was to end us being killed by them and, put on lockdown and sent to the SHU and punished for that. And once we did that, like CDC, the guards that worked in these prisons, especially on the main line, started to like, dang, these guys aren't, going at it anymore. And so what's going to happen? They're going to look at us as the enemy now, and they might start to try to take off on us. And they were really scared because most of the time they would instigate this type of stuff. I mean, you all heard of stories where they have actually been indicted, and of course, just like the police shootings out here, they're never really convicted. But so I think that's a huge step. And now on most of the main lines, there's less violence, there's less riots, there's less racial tension. We're getting along much better, and it's helping to show that, look, for decades you said that prison gangs create all the violence and tension on the yards, but in fact, with releasing everybody, there's no longer that violence. There's no longer them youngsters taking off or doing whatever they want. You have more guidance, and you have these elders that teach them, respect and how to conduct themselves as men and to respect and treat other men like men. So I think it has changed the whole dynamics of the general populations as far as violence and racial tension.
Would anybody like to add?
Yeah, I'll add one more thing to that, which is that one of the demands of the hunger strike, so in 2011 there were 5 core demands of the hunger strikes, and one of, was access to meaningful programs, nutritious food, access to medical care. But one of the demands was to no longer have group punishment. And this idea that if one person of a racial group is found to have violated a rule, that everyone in that racial group would be punished. And that is by design of part of the segregation of races within California prisons. And so it's important to realize the historical context, that part of the reason behind the level of violence and fear that we attach to particularly California prisons is rooted in segregation by design, by unit, and this operation of group-based punishment. And so that's one of the hunger strikers' demands, and I think one of the most powerful things of the agreement to end hostilities, which has come out of same leaders, people at Pelican Bay. And now, because of release of so many people in solitary, has the ability to sort of be spread and communicated within GP yards, is sort of taking that principle and applying it interracially as well, which is that, if there is a conflict between individuals on a yard, that you're going to do what you can to resolve that on an individual basis before you bring in the group dynamic. And so that's really powerful to take and contextualize and to understand that the violence that we're operating on, that you're playing into, the violence of the state, and to continue to punish one another with group punishments. And so to take that principle and to apply it internally, and some of the things that I've heard recently, which, to me, having been, corresponding with people and trying to understand what's going on for many years, to me, this is one of the most powerful signs I've seen of change within general population, is that recently there have been sports games played interracially. So you have a basketball court where brown and blacks are playing against one another, and that is a peaceful exchange. And you have to understand that, places like the basketball court or the baseball court, or even a bench, right? When there's 3 picnic tables and there are 4 or 5 racially segregated groups, like that property, that place within the yard is extraordinarily valuable. And there is, violence around owning and possessing power within the, internally, because that's all there is to own. Right, and that is an expression of power. And so to have a basketball court seated to be a space of interracial, interaction and communication and engagement in a positive way, I mean, unbelievable and really powerful and super simple, and really, I think, is in many ways a direct extension of, the agreement to end hostilities and the work done, interracial organization and collectivizing, from the inside, and spreading that within internal communities.
2 things that I wanted to clarify. I don't know if Michael mentioned the green wall. Do y'all know what that is? The green wall was, at least I know they had it in Salinas Valley, which was a prison gang by a prison guard. They were known as the green wall. It was in Salinas, right? In Salinas Valley, right? And they in Corcoran too, right? And then the gladiator fights. The gladiator fights was mostly like, from I remember, it was this is what I would hear when I was growing up in the '90s. They would get in isolate in the hole, or administrative segregation in the shoe in Corcoran. They'll take people, 2 blacks, 2 Mexicans, put them on the yard, which is a small little yard, and then bam, they know they're gonna start fighting. They start fighting, and then they get shot, and they were betting money on it.
With live ammunition, they would shoot them.
They were betting, they were like hedging bets. Like you'll see, like they did investigations. There'll be like 20 people up in the control booth. Like, oh, I got my money on this guy. I got my money on them. That was. I just wanted to clarify that though. Since you brought it up.
Yeah, not everybody knows.
So it seems that there's been a progress, for the better, as far as bringing a togetherness. How would you say that this could be not replicated, but what impact, or would this have on our communities? Could you guys, anybody, talk about that?
Yeah, I'm done talking about that. Real quick. I think it's important to recognize that in regards to the hunger strike, when Pelican Bay was built, lawyers were already there, like litigating and saying like this is not just, right? But it wasn't getting the attention that it deserved. Like if you were in the shoe, you knew who were the lawyers that were doing the work. Oh yeah, California Prison Focus. They're the ones that they're our allies. Prison law office and all these places, right? These are our allies out there. But like it wasn't something that your family was talking about. It wasn't something that the community was talking about. You know what I mean, it was something.
On the news.
It wasn't on the news, and this is like something that was like shameful. Like, yeah, my son's in prison. Like, well, that's already bad enough. But you say like, yeah, but now he's also in solitary confinement. Like, damn, he must really be bad, because that's the narrative, right? Because only the worst of the worst go to Pelican Bay Shoe, And so it wasn't a conversation that was very being had, right? But then once the hunger strike started and familias got involved, that just changed the game, And family and communities got involved, and they started organizing with the organizers and the community activists, and really just amplified the voice of what was going on. And it came out of the shadows, right? Like families were coming out, like, yo, I never actually talked to about my brother. He's been in the shoe since 1991 or whatever, And these conversations weren't being had. So I think that was something that for me was instrumental in creating the change that we've had, right? And also going back to me for the end hostilities, it came out in October, I believe, October 8, 2013, or 12. October 12, yeah. That was powerful. That was powerful, right? Because I'm somebody that grew up being told Danny, you're going to end up dead or you're going to end up in prison. And my response was always like, I don't give a fuck. At 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, that was our response. And it wasn't just that I came up with that model. Like, a lot of us were like that. A lot of us, right? We just didn't give a fuck, right? And like, my response was like, that was my response. And it was like, either I end up dead or I end up in prison. And if I end up in prison, I'm going to go to Pelican Bay Shoe. Because for me, that was a status symbol. You know what I mean? You go to Pelican Bay Shoe to get your status. Just like you go to Harvard, you go to Berkeley, you go to Yale to get your status. But it's just a whole different system. You know what I mean?
Can I just add something? And I just wanted to add really quickly that as you asked me about people that I visited across the country, prisoners in New Jersey, Florida, New York that I would visit would be like, you're from California? Tell me about the hunger strike. You know, I mean, that just spread like wildfire. And to upend a narrative that's controlled by an institution as powerful as our system of mass incarceration, and to change that story is an incredible precedent. And it's you know, it's what people do when people organize and resist. They change the story, and that can't be changed back, you know? I mean, laws change and they come and go, right? Administrations come and go. The political climate can change. But when new stories are put into our communities and passed down to the younger generations, that lives forever.
I'm just going to throw in one. I know I already spoke on this, but that, you know, I want to throw out one more thing about what built the agreement to end hostilities, and that it, you know, just acknowledging the years of trust building within such isolation that led to, you know, the ability to even start to have these conversations being so powerful. But I'd like to really call out the women and the supporters and the loved ones and the family members of every single prisoner in all of the state of California and beyond, but you know, particularly during those hunger strikes, when there was this realization that, you know, people that you loved are putting their life on the line, that this was so serious, and there was an upsurge of interest and engagement and visits. And I've heard from some of the men that I correspond with that something that really started to change the way they thought about the men who they served time alongside was hearing that, you know, Dolores Canales, you know, the founder of California Families Against Solitary Confinement, is coordinating rides all the way from LA up to Pelican Bay, and she's bringing, you know, Black mothers and Black wives, along with Latino sisters and Latino wives, up to visit strikers together. And when, you know, I've been told directly that when I heard, like, what, you know, my mom's hanging out with his mom, you know, when they like each other, and that, you know, they're cool, then, like, maybe we can be cool too. And that, you know, is so powerful, and that's, you know, the power of connection from the outside, but also those unspoken voices and the support that comes, you know, through living in resistance and challenging standards by building community across those lines, you know, spreads. So I just want to call those women in.
Thank you. I'd like to say something about that I think is very important. I grew up in a community where blacks and browns went at it as far as like gangbanging and, you know, try to kill each other. And I think that one of the good things of the end of hostilities that came from prison is it's trickling down to the streets, because we all sooner or later get out and we teach the younger ones and some knuckleheads our age that this ain't cool, this is what's going on. To end that, because out here in the political climate right now with Trump and all this, you know, white supremacy going on, we need to stick together. We need to stop killing each other, and we need to stick together, because together we can be very strong.
Given all of the experiences and obstacles and barriers that have had to, you know, been overcome, what do you suggest is an effective strategy, you know, to help, you know, other places with this problem? I'll leave it open.
An effective strategy as far as ending solitary confinement?
in
Yes.
other states?
Yeah. Other states, yeah.
I mean, I think that obviously I'm a storyteller, so I focus on the storytelling and the humanization. I think also connecting it to other struggles is incredibly, right now, for our movements to be unified and for these sort of, yeah, these connections to be made between Standing Rock, between standing up against police brutality, and just sort of these networks and kind of like beehives formed is really crucial.
That resonates with me. You know, I think there's a lot of emphasis in the news about the Ashker settlement, and, you know, I have the privilege of having a law degree and saying, oh, well, the law can set us free. And I don't really believe that for a lot of reasons. But, and I know that I kind of came into this saying, well, I have a lot of criticisms about where we're at and how far we've come, and that we need to, take what we've accomplished and understand that movement forward, as long as we're grounding it in an analysis that understands this isn't enough and we must continue going. And so, I think that the story of California that's so powerful to me is that this change is not just about the lawyers. It's not just about a few people with resources who decided to come in and, convince a senator that they have an ear that something should be changed and make it a pet issue for a year or so. This has been a protracted and a long and engaged struggle that has, been centered at the folks on the inside and amplifying the voices of those who have experienced, some of the most suffering, and following their lead, right? I mean, the agreement to end hostilities does not need to stop at Pelican Bay or in California prisons. I think it's a message that should be, passed throughout all of the states. And I think that's really where change starts to happen, is understanding, who our enemies are, where power is held, and how something, Michael and I were just talking about this recently, that power is held by the, because of the people who give it to them. Right, that we give people the power that they hold over us and over others. And so, I think that's really what the agreement is about if we're continuing to fight with one another, we'll never really, band together. And that's where we start making changes. And I think I'm happy to report that solitary confinement is starting to be, in terms of long-term indefinite, on its way out. Colorado just last week announced that they're going to end it for more than 15 days. Mississippi, there's other states that are like, listen, this isn't working. And as soon as they see that, there is positive programming that comes out of it and there are less violence in facilities, it becomes evident. But I don't think that, like I said, until we really approach the culture and we really start having conversations with those who we oppose, will we really be able to make those changes.
Yeah, right. I think also acknowledging the role of the folks in there, right? Like, we got to shout out the families that did all the work in the organizing, but also just the men in there to be able to come to this conclusion, like, yo, this shit ain't working. We need to figure something else out to be able to end long-term solitary confinement. And so the whole, the call to end, the call to end all, the agreement to end hostilities, that's important, but also the fact that, so then what role do incarcerated people play in this movement, right? Because just because they locked up don't mean that they can't, that they don't got a role in this, right? And I think that's a clear indication of the hunger strike that shows that incarcerated people can lead, be part of this movement, right?
Kevin, can I take this moment to read something from the plaintiffs, actually?
Yes,
because I have a
please.
statement that was provided just last week, in honor of the 2-year anniversary. And I'll just read part of it. It says, this settlement represents a monumental victory for prisoners and an important step toward our goal of ending solitary confinement in California and across the country. California's agreement to abandon indeterminate SHU confinement based on gang affiliation demonstrates the power of unity and collective action. This victory was achieved by the efforts of people in prison, their families and loved ones, and outside supporters. Our movement rests on a foundation of unity, our agreement to end hostilities. It is our hope that this groundbreaking agreement to end the violence between the various ethnic groups in California prisons will inspire not only state prisoners, but jail detainees, county prisoners, and our communities on the street to oppose ethnic and racial violence. From this foundation, the prisoners' human rights movement is awakening the conscience of the nation to recognize that we are fellow human beings As the recent statements of President Obama and Justice Kennedy illustrate, our nation is turning against solitary confinement. We celebrate this victory while, at the same time, we recognize that achieving our goal of fundamentally transforming the criminal justice system and stopping the practice of warehousing people in prison will be a protracted struggle. We are fully committed to that effort and invite you to join us.
Thank you, Tava. You know, just yesterday I was talking with a gentleman, and you know, I was sort of explaining to him, you know, just the basic essence of what we do on our campus. You know, trying to get formerly incarcerated individuals, you know, into college to get a higher education, and you know, the core essence of our existence is just pretty much support. It's just a peer network. You know, it's a friend on campus to help one another. And he asked me, why do you think that people coming out of prison, this is somebody who's not formally incarcerated, why is it that you think, you know, you guys, you know, help one another? And the only answer I could think of is just humanity. You know, when you take everything else away, you know, our instinct is just to help one another. I'd like to open it up for question and answering. We have about 20 minutes left, so is that okay with you guys, unless you guys had something else to?
No, no.
Okay. All right, thank you.
We have another mic, this one. Okay.
Hello. All right, cool. This one works.
So my name is Zanetta Smith. I work at LA Kitchen, and I am a social worker and counselor to a lot of individuals who have been formerly incarcerated, more specifically lifers. So my job in counseling is to help them process their experiences so they could work and maintain their job. And so I would say, as a counselor, what can I do to stay in the mindset of what you all have experienced to help people get employed and maintain jobs? Because what I would say the cases that come to me are the things that are hard for them to do is the human interaction, and that's what I help them with the most. At LA Kitchen, we have a family meal every day, and for some of the lifers, that's the hardest part because they're not used to eating with people. And so, you know, they'll run into my office like, I can't do this. I can't eat with everyone today. And so as a counselor, what could I do to help my clients more?
First of all, I'd like to say what you're doing is real work. That's ending mass incarceration, because there's a lot of groups that say, oh, we're, you know, helping formerly incarcerated people, but they're really profiting. And I think the number one thing to end mass incarceration, when people get out, they need jobs. Yeah. That's real. All that other stuff is irrelevant, right? They need jobs. So I think that's awesome what you guys are doing. And I think that family dinner thing is awesome, because when I got out, I was like, you know, I stayed with my parents for a while, and I was like, nobody here eats dinner together no more. My sister's up in the room, my dad's in the living room watching TV, and I'm like, you know, because like I was telling people, when I got locked up, it's like they put me in a capsule, right, for close to 20 years. And then after that time, they just opened the capsule and let me out, right? So my experience and memories of the streets is that 19, 20 years ago, right? So I kind of wanted that, you know, and when we did that, it was awesome. I felt really like a true family, and I think that's one great thing. And I think just understanding where people are coming from, the environment, and the issue of, you know, not being able to socialize with people. And it's not because we're antisocial, it's because we're kind of nervous, right? We don't know what to say. We don't want to offend you. We don't want to, you know, disrespect you or make you fear us or make you look at us like this fool's crazy, right? So we tend to stay to ourselves. But I think if you initiate the conversation, because that's one thing when I got out, I was like, I would look at people and look in their eyes, and they'll always be on their phone like this, especially on campus, right? And it was like it felt weird. People wouldn't look at you in the eyes and talk to you. They would always look down, and it made me feel like, are they scared of me? Are they, you know, do I look that ugly? Damn, you know, what is it, you know? But I think that's one of the things that like everybody said on this panel. The number one thing: human interaction. Like look at them in the eyes, talk to them as human beings, and initiate that conversation. I think that's the best thing you could do.
What I like to add is become the resource, right? Just learn. Maybe you can't help with therapy, but where is a resource that does that? Where is a resource that helps with mental health services? Learn and find out the resources around you that you can refer people there if you don't have the resource. Me, I can't do everything for everybody, and that's a heavy load to try to, you know, in the work that I do, I'm all about providing access to higher education for formerly incarcerated people, right? Community college, Cal States, UCs, let's do this, right? Bachelor's, master's, PhDs. But I can't tell people like, you know, I need a job. Well, I don't do that, but I let me know an organization that does, that helps, you know, folks that are formerly incarcerated get a job. So, yeah, become a resource. That's what I do. That's the way I see my role. I'm a resource. Oh, man.
Yeah.
Hey, how's everyone doing? This is amazing. I just want to thank you guys for putting this panel together. This is a great panel, and it's very necessary to have this conversation. I actually had the opportunity to go into Pelican Bay. It was, you know, about a few months ago with Danny, and we got to go in there and we got to talk to all the brothers in there, and it was beautiful. And something that happened in there that really got me real emotional, and I started to cry, is I seen a big homie from the blacks who had been in, you know, been in the shoe for 20-something years, 32 years in the shoe, and then the big homie from the south side, I seen him hug. You know, they hugged, and that was beautiful to me. You know what I'm saying? And so I wanted to share that with everyone because things are definitely shifting, but as they shift, they start to look for new ways to attack us. And so I want to make everyone aware that, you know, my cousin, her Nino, right now is sitting back in the shoe. You know, Daryl Baca's back in the shoe, and they got him on conspiracy. And this is their new attack. This is their new attack on us, and a conspiracy to commit murder. And they have no facts. They have nothing but just a trumped up thing. And he was doing amazing work, you know, with DeFi Ventures and with everything. So, you know, we have to counter this new attack because they are going to refill that shoe. And this is their new way to do it in an indeterminate way. So how can we do that together and as a collective, again, because this is their new one. It's conspiracy.
Yeah, I'm hearing a lot about conspiracy, and the thing about what you got to understand about the prison within the prisons is that there's no due process. None of the things that you think about that even so-called protections that we see in the criminal injustice system out here on the streets, you know, those are not in place at all inside in the hearing officers' rooms, right? And let's start with the fact that the person who's making the decision is also a guard, right? So. You know, these are communities as well, and these folks are out in rural California, all across the state, and they have one another. And so the guards are unionized, and they're not about to call one another a liar, right? And who cares about the prisoners, right? The whole point is to keep yourself safe. And so throwing somebody under the bus, it's pretty easy who your option is going to be when it's, you know, he said versus he said. And so, you know, some of the things about due process is that, first of all, it's just process. It's just procedure, right? There's nothing really in the Constitution that protects you substantively from anything. You know, it's just that they can take away, you know, the government can take away your liberty, but in order to do so, they have to follow certain rules, right? And we call that due process. And those rules don't apply inside prison. And what does apply is, you know, there's a Supreme Court case from 1976 that is a whole different world away, you know, that sort of set out some very minimal protections, right, processes. But with the conspiracy to kill a correctional officer, which it's always to kill a correctional officer, you can have one witness, and you need a standard of what's called some evidence. Now, some evidence is not a preponderance. It's certainly not beyond a reasonable doubt. And in fact, there's some question of whether it even is as much as probable cause, right? So we're talking about on the streets, a cop would have to evaluate whether or not they have enough evidence to even arrest you and start an investigation. You need less evidence for another officer to say, nah, that's enough, right? And also the use of confidential information, which is to say, hello, somebody else has written a report and you're never going to get to see it, and your lawyers won't even get to see it. And you're not entitled to a lawyer, but, let me just tell you that somebody said that you're a dangerous person, and so you're going away. Well, who was it? When was it? What did they say? How did they, what exactly did they say, and when did they tell you that? And how am I going to lodge a defense if there is no information provided, that it gives you notice of what's being said against you? But you should also tell your cousin that there was recently a court case, a habeas corpus, that was overturning a 115 specifically for conspiracy. And that's probably one of 3 in the entire state. And it was a decision that just came out, and it's a long process. It took 3 years. And he spent a full 48 months in the SHU, and he, filed his 602 after the 115 was concluded, and he went through the entire appeals process. And he, it took him about a year after filing, and the court said there wasn't even some evidence because they did not document that confidential informant's information well enough. And so, too late, he's already served the time, right? His 48-month term is already over, but the CDCR was required to dismiss it and to give him his good time credit back. And so I'm optimistic that, that case can now be used as support for others. Excuse me. So yeah, I can give you that information. It's in Re Correa, but I'd be happy to hit you up afterwards. And, yeah, absolutely. Right. No. Yeah. And they're not going to update the law library with this case anytime soon.
What's messed up is that you can't even file a 602 against a conspiracy.
Right.
So you just sit and you're just under investigation, and
Yeah.
this is their new tactic to give you an indeterminate shoot.
Right.
So you literally could be in there on conspiracy
Right.
for the rest of your life.
Well, because they're going to say, well, this is serious enough that we might have to refer it to the DA, and the DA hasn't decided whether they're going to prosecute yet. So we're just going to sit here and waiting, and that's one of these issues that the Ashker attorneys are aware of and are trying to say, hey, we're not done yet, but because they're not actually in long-term SHU and it hasn't been 10 years yet, the court isn't prepared to say quite yet. I mean, we'll see. The monitoring hasn't concluded yet, but this is one of those issues, and your cousin is not alone.
Hi. So my name's Racina. I'm formerly incarcerated. I actually had a question that involves drug and drug addiction. When it came to the efforts that you guys, have made through filing the lawsuits and litigating cases, and did you guys run into any problems, or do you see like drug addiction being a weakness that could have a negative impact on this progress that you guys have been making?
I think drug addiction is a bad impact on anything, right? It poisons the community. It poisons the gentlemen's minds and women's minds, and yeah, I think drug addiction period is bad. Drugs in general is bad.
Mm-hmm. Did you ever run into problems where some of the people that were supposed to be banding with you were turning their backs on you because of drugs, or for drugs, I should say?
I mean, that's kind of a, there's many reasons why people turn their backs, especially people who say, you know what, I can't take this no more, and debrief, snitch on people. I don't understand that, but people do it. Weak minds, or some people are, I don't know, that I can't justify it. I don't know what their reasons are, but there's jealousy within any community. There's backstabbing. There's people who want power or who feel they're not being heard. So there's many reasons people would turn on each other. But yeah, I think drug addiction is a lot, and I've personally seen that. When I went to the main line, I was surprised how many younger homies were addicted to heroin. Like in my days, I was like the old veteranos used to, slam dope. But now you got guys 19, 20 slamming dope like it ain't nothing. And you know, part of the reason of that as well is because there's so much of it in prison because it's lucrative, right? Just like cell phones. But where does it come from? How does it get in there? You know, and that's part of the corruption of the guards that work there, you know. They're profiting off of people's pain and suffering and charging them, you know, exorbitant amounts of money for small amounts of drugs. And knowing that it's so addictive and these people have no hope, and some people drown their sorrows and their pain in drugs. So, yeah, it's definitely a problem. And I think it starts in the communities as well as in prisons, but it's hard to tell somebody to make a rule like, you know what, no more drug use.
Yeah, I also just wanted to, going back to that question of how do we continue the resistance, is just do kind of like a shout out, or just to say that, sustaining resistance is also about sustaining healing. And continuing to have healing be a really essential part. Because, the state is going to continue to come up with new ways. When we make a win, they're going to come up with more insidious ways. If solitary confinement is abolished once and for all and made illegal, there's going to be other ways, that they maintain control in mass incarceration in a dehumanizing way. And so in the meantime, drawing on our incredible resilience, it means drawing upon our incredible ability to, I'm an artist and I'm also a healer, and I need a lot of healing, and I came out of prison and it was about 7 years before I took that seriously. Because I was just going hard, because I'm like, I'm a warrior, I can get through anything. And I see that in so many people coming out, because there's so much work to be done. But you will crash eventually, and then to when you do, if you sustain that community. So.
My name is Chris. I'm formerly incarcerated from Columbia University. I've been studying drugs for like the past 6 years. I'll answer any questions after because I don't want to turn the focus out here. But just when we talk about drugs, we need to be careful of the narrative that we express, because we need to more focus on like not just drugs are bad, but what conditions lead to drug abuse, such as poverty, discrimination. Because when we trauma, when we're give this narrative like drugs are bad, it kind of feeds the fuel to the fire of we need to do something. We're going to pass these laws. If you look at these new heroin laws, there's always a bunch of money allocated to law enforcement.
To touch on that real quick, Chris, gracias, right? When you talk about why these 19, 20-year-old kids are using heroin in prison, which is something that you never actually seen, well, what else would you do if you were serving a life without and you didn't have nothing else to cope with? That heroin kills the pain, y'all. But it does, so a lot of people are using it to cope in there.
I completely agree, and I appreciate you raising that. And I think there's we can talk about the destructive nature of drug use and how it does hurt movements, and also recognize and acknowledge that it's not a simple situation, and it's not a simple story, and it's always contextualized. And one other fact that's just coming up for me is a really active issue right now, and a lot of the folks who we're working with in PAN and Prisoner Advocacy Network are folks, and it's amazing to me how we'll be working with a person for months and months, and then all of a sudden we'll get a letter, and you can just feel in this letter what's going on. The handwriting is out of control, and they're no longer focused on whatever we'd been working on, and they're saying, my morphine is gone. And there is something happening in California prisons right now that we are afraid of drug abuse. And so what we're going to do is we're just going to give Tylenol. And so you've got individuals who have been on morphine for chronic pain, who have bullets lodged in their bodies. I don't know, all of the medical histories, who have, not to get gory with it, but immense, pain on the body and chronic pain, and which has previously been dealt with by providing morphine in controlled ways, and now all of a sudden, no weaning off, no withdrawal, just like done. And then you ask questions of why we're seeing heroin in prison, because we're setting up for failure. Absolutely, unbelievably so. And so that is a serious issue that's happening right now, and it really contextualizes, when there's access to certain drugs and not other drugs, the choices, get a lot more complicated. And so, we need to be thinking at all of these levels of the way in which, these decisions get made.
Yeah, it's good. I mean, when you look back just on, the war on drugs, period, I mean, what purpose did drugs serve, and whose purpose did they serve? And it's not just, morphine to address, chronic pain in the body from legitimate pain, but also, these other programs, psychological programs, triple CMS, programs where individuals, may or may not even have, mental problems, but yet, okay, we're going to address it with, a hyper X amount of dose of this, every day to keep people not only sedated, but also, yeah. These programs, and the purpose of, drugs serve, like back then, in prison, it's another tactic, just like solitary confinement is. I think we may have room for one more question, and then we'll call it a wrap.
My name is Siggy, and I want to thank Michael for inviting Human Rights Pen Pals. I heard a lot of community outreach from us, and the individuals are inside. I can't tell you how important it is for them to hear from someone on the outside of what's going on when they have no hope or anything. It's really important that we on the outside realize what they're going on in the inside. And the way to do that and to combat that loneliness and solitary and sense of hopelessness is to reach out to them. Tell them that you're there. Tell them that we need you. That's how they get over this. That's how they get over the hump, is by you guys telling them, you know what, we've got your back. We're here. And there's nothing more like it. We have artwork out there. Look at it. Read their bios. Some of them don't have artwork. They have stories to tell. They're heartwarming stories that really touch all of us. So think about what you can do, and if you can't do what you want to do, be a pen pal. Make sure they're out there. We have postcards that you could write. We have literature that you could read, actually, about the solitary hunger strike. Get involved. Be a part of an outside movement to help the individuals on the inside. Thank you.
Well, I'll say one thing before Michael speaks about the Pen Pal project, which is that I think there can be a lot of barriers just for us in terms of how do we get connected, or how do we reach out, or how do we get involved, and is anything that we do meaningful, and how can we really, combat something that can be so overwhelming and so out of our control. And I really appreciate Siggy raising up the Pen Pal project, because it really is as simple as sitting down and writing a letter. And the Pen Pal project has made it really easy, and that they've, coordinated, and there's, folks, and they have a support network to help you sort of learn about all of the different acronyms or whatever you are going to learn about. But, I am grateful to, the risks that I've taken, and just sort of writing back to people, or just, you don't even necessarily know, that's how Michael and I met. And is that I wrote back and I said, I don't know if I can take your case, because I'm not really a lawyer that good. And he was like, yeah, but you wrote back, and that already is doing something. Don't you understand? Like, you've already done something, and that's real. And so that connection, so powerfully that Sarah's talking about, can be really life-changing for everybody involved.
And also, sorry, it's a political act, writing these letters. I mean, it's a personal and it's a political act, where those two things come together, because the information goes in, the information comes out, it makes the walls breathe, and it chips away at that power structure. And I think that I truly believe that actions like the hunger strike, that have had so many global ramifications, start with those relationships that are formed through visitation and writing letters. So.
In closing, I would just like to thank you all for coming and sitting through all this very patiently. Thank you. And on the last note, when I was in prison, I got a postcard, and it had that little thing on it called the box, right? And there was some girl who went to the box, and they handed out postcards, and to me, getting a letter was like everything. It really made you feel good, and so that's what made me look into Sarah Moore and her play. And I hope that all of you will come and join us at 7 o'clock. Take a break, maybe have some food, and watch her show. Thank you. Thank you all.
Thank you.